My name is Jonathan Marks. I'm the director of the bioethics program here at Penn State. Welcome to the first lecture in the Rock Ethics Institute's 2013 Research Ethics Lecture Series. And welcome also to the 2013 Harold K. Schilling Memorial Lecture in Science, Technology, and Society. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Sheldon Krimsky, our lecturer. But before I do, I would like to thank those who made today possible. In particular, Nikolai Morar and Jonathan Beaver, postdoctoral fellows at the Rock Ethics Institute, who've put in a lot of work putting together this lecture series. And of course, the staff of the Institute, including Rob Peeler, Deb Trialonis, and Carolyn Umbrecht. The Schilling Memorial Lecture focuses on the connection or connections among ethics, science, technology, and the human condition. And it was endowed in memory of Dr. Schilling, a physicist, professor, and former dean of the graduate school at Penn State. Dr. Schilling was also president of the American Association of Physics Teachers in the late 1940s. As with all Rock Ethics Institute events, the Institute is incredibly grateful to Doug and Julie Rock for their extremely generous support. And we are here in the Foster Auditorium in the Petit Library, and of course we are, as always, grateful to the university libraries for their support. And now to our guest of honor. Dr. Krimsky is the Lenore Stern Professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at Tufts University, and also currently the Carol Zicklin Professor of Philosophy at Brooklyn College. Professor Krimsky received his bachelor's and master's degrees in physics from Brooklyn College, CUNY, and Purdue University, respectively, and a master's and doctorate in philosophy from Boston University. So as you'll see, he's a truly interdisciplinary scholar. Dr. Krimsky's research has focused on the links between science and technology, ethics and public policy. He's the author of 10 books, including the groundbreaking volume in 2003, Science in the Private Interest, provocatively subtitled, Has the Lure of Profits Corrupted Biomedical Research? A book that indeed always generates animated discussion among my students. His latest book, 2013, is entitled Biotechnology in Our Lives, What Modern Genetics Can Tell You About Assisted Reproduction, Human Behavior, and Personalized Medicine, and much more. And I'm sure it's much more, co-authored with Jeremy Gruber. Dr. Krimsky has also published over 180 essays and reviews, appearing in numerous books and journals, and among them, his 2012 piece in Society, Technology, and Human Values, entitled Do Financial Conflicts of Interest Bias Research? An Inquiry into the Funding Effect Hypothesis, a paper that again generated a fascinating animated discussion at our bioethics colloquium last year, and made us all the more convinced that we should have Dr. Krimsky here to talk to us. Professor Krimsky has served on several advisory committees and study panels. He holds numerous editorial and advisory board positions and has been awarded many accolades, including election as a fellow of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. Now, although I've been familiar with Dr. Krimsky's scholarship for many, many years, our paths first crossed in 2011 when we participated in a symposium at Harvard on research ethics run by Sheila Jasanoff, director of their STS program. And I've been waiting ever since for an opportunity to bring him back here. So I'm delighted that the ROC's 2013 Research Ethics Lecture Series has given us the opportunity to do so. It is truly a pleasure to have Dr. Krimsky give the first lecture in that series and to deliver the 2013 Harold K. Schilling Memorial Lecture in Science, Technology, and Society. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Krimsky to speak to us on the ethical foundations of conflict of interest policies in science and medicine. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be at Penn State. I have visited almost all of the land-grant universities, and apparently Penn State must have fallen through the cracks, having spent 2 years at Purdue, which is another one of the great land-grant schools. I came into studying conflicts of interest unsuspectingly. I was supervising a research study with my students on one of the great hazardous waste contamination issues in Massachusetts. And before our study was completed, the vice president of one of the largest chemical companies in the world came to the then president at Tufts University to get me fired and to stop the release of the study. And I realized at that time how important it was for universities to have autonomous researchers who were not under the control of other institutions, especially profit-making institutions, and that we would all lose a great deal if the universities were simply handmaidens to corporations or places that just didn't like what was being studied or what was being published. So that led me to this area, and I started looking at this area in biotechnology, and very often I was asked the question, oh, conflict of interest is not an ethical issue, it's just political correctness, or it's some other issue. And that got me to think about what there really was in ethics that was related to conflict of interest, especially in science and medicine. And that's what I would like to talk about today. So first, the historical determinants of the closer ties between universities and industry. And there were always ties in various disciplines, but something happened around the 1980s. And it was fairly important in terms of its effect on universities. First, there was declining public funds for research. When Reagan came in, the National Institutes of Health and NSF research budgets were flattened, and that created quite a stir at the universities, who were trying to figure out how they were going to maintain their research enterprises. Second, there were federal policies for supporting technology transfer, giving incentives for corporations to actually move technology from the universities to the marketplace. The assumption that was held by many, the majority of the Senate and Congress, was you have all these great discoveries in the university that were in the drawers of the researchers, and they never really were getting out and being transferred to society. And that was probably true in some respects. There was also a trend toward academic capitalism, a term that other people have coined. That is, the production and marketing of knowledge being connected. It wasn't sufficient that scientists were simply producing knowledge. They felt they had a new obligation to transfer and market the knowledge that they have produced. And then there was also new rules on patenting knowledge and discovery. All of these were factors in creating closer ties between corporations and departments. And this is the kind of image that was presented in the media. This was in the Atlantic Monthly. And of course, out of this came the contested issues between science and commerce. Does corporate funding distort the values in science and medical practice? Does conflict of interest impair scientific integrity? How has the corporate influence of science played out in certain areas like drug and environmental research? And is there a funding effect in science, which I will explain as we go on, which means, does the source of funding, especially from private sources, affect the outcome of the research, the quality and the outcome of the research? Before 1985, nobody even asked this question. It was assumed that the scientific community, that the mission and value of the scientific community was to produce objective knowledge, and there were no studies that try to frame the question, does the source of funding affect the outcome of research? And of course, if university-industry conflicts of interest have become a problem, what can be done about it? Is this just part of the evolution of the modern university? Is disclosure an appropriate antidote? How can all the necessary research be funded without private sponsorship? So much of our university research is sponsored. Most of the drug research is sponsored by drug companies in academic settings or in private settings. And what ethical standards are needed, and what are the ethical grounds for conflict of interest regulations and management? So this gives you an idea, this chart gives you an idea, if in a Medline search of articles on conflict of interest. And you'll see that, around 1980, 84 to 90, you start to see something happening. And then all of a sudden, by 1990, the number of articles discussing conflict of interest in the scientific and medical area starts to skyrocket. Now, in thinking about the ethical foundations of conflict of interest, I came up with four, I guess you'd call them rules or ideas that are at the root of ethics and conflict of interest. And I'll summarize these and then I'll go into each of them. Stewardship. Scientists use public funds, and perhaps conflict of interest could, in fact, enter into their role, their stewardship role, of handling public funds. Transparency, openness is compromised with respect to some of the funding that goes on at the university because some of it is quite secretive. Consequentialism, well, if that is an effect, it must be the distortion of science that comes out of certain types of funding. And finally, scientific integrity, or the loss of the norm of disinterestedness and the appearance of objectivity. So these are the four possible ethical considerations that I came up with in thinking about conflict of interest. And I'm going to go through each of these and see whether or not they hold any weight. Stewardship first. Government employees are stewards of the public policies, its land, its laws, and its regulations. Federal officials who use their position to enhance their personal finances are in conflict with their fiduciary role as stewards of public resources which are in their trust. That's why we have conflict of interest rules for people in government. Now, in case you haven't read the Constitution recently, the people who wrote it, they had some ideas about conflict of interest. Here's one phrase in the Constitution: "And no person holding any office of profit or trust under them shall, without the consent of the Congress, accept of any present, emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state." Underlying that is that it would be a conflict of interest to govern and to be part of the governing function of this country and to accept gifts from foreign governments. Unfortunately, they didn't go far enough and prevent the gifts from people who were in this country, especially corporations, but we're still fighting those. And here's another conflict of interest rule in the Constitution. No senator or representative shall, during the time for which he was elected, be appointed to any civil office under the authority of the United States which shall have been created, or the emoluments there whereof shall have been increased during such time that person. In other words, you don't want a congressman and a senator creating salary for him or her that's designated for them when they retire from their position. Somebody knew what was going on or what could happen. So they had some idea of conflict of interest, and at least had a few phrases in the Constitution. Well, getting back to stewardship, does it really apply to scientists? It certainly applies to public servants. The stewardship frame, in my mind, doesn't fit well with the university scientists. Researchers are stewards of federal funds. For their grants, they're expected to manage the resources as contracted. But unlike government employees, grant stewardship does not entail a concern over conflicts of interest. Of course, they have to follow the rules of the granting agency, and they can't use the grant for illicit purposes. That's all correct. But that doesn't really fit the kinds of issues that arise in conflict of interest. Also, federal policies themselves encourage faculty to partner with for-profit companies and to start their own businesses from discoveries made with federal funds. So the stewardship frame in that context just doesn't work. It doesn't fit. It doesn't work as an ethical foundation for dealing with conflicts of interest in academia. If the U.S. government embraced the stewardship frame for conflicts of interest in academia, it would have to address institutional conflicts of interest of many universities. And the U.S. government has deferred addressing institutional conflicts of interest in its regulations of conflicts of interest. So, again, stewardship doesn't seem to work as a building block for ethical foundations. Let's look at transparency and science. Openness is a hallmark of scientific ethics. This includes sharing data, disclosure of bias, real authorship, control over data, and transparency of methods. Insofar as conflict of interest may be perceived to bias the outcome of results or establish hidden norms, it should be disclosed. Now, there's arguments that say, what does conflict of interest have to do with the quality of the research? A reviewer might say, well, I'm reviewing this paper for what is stated in the paper, its methods, what the authors have claimed, and the data that they have acquired. Conflict of interest shouldn't be a factor in my review of the paper. Well, they have a point. In an ideal world, maybe conflict of interest wouldn't be a factor. But as we shall see later on, it turns out there's scientific evidence that it is a factor in bias. Well, what do? You can either prohibit it or you can make it transparent so people can look at it carefully, or maybe do a second review of the paper. If there was a paper out that said that there was a safe cigarette, and you looked down and you saw that Philip Morris had supported the research, you might, feel that maybe this was a biased paper, or at least you might want to look at it very, very carefully. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you have a suspicion that there might be a potential bias carried out by the author, then you should do a more careful peer review and subject it to the highest standards that you're familiar with. Ghostwriting, if we're talking about transparency, there is ghostwriting in science, unfortunately, especially in the medical field. And there's an incentive for ghostwriting. There's an incentive for the drug companies to get famous, well-known scientists to put their name on a ghostwritten article. And there is incentive for the scientists, money incentive, to put their name on a ghostwritten article. The incentive for the companies, the drug companies particularly, to get a famous scientist to put their name on a ghostwritten article is the law that the FDA has that the drug companies can't promote drugs that have not yet been licensed. Well, the drug company can't promote drugs that have not been licensed, but certainly somebody who's not part of the drug company can write an article saying, yeah, this drug was very good in my research. So the drug companies have a particular interest in getting articles ghostwritten. And David Cullen wrote a piece in Anesthesiology some time ago. He says, recently I was shown a letter written to an academic anesthesiologist that seriously undermines the integrity of the publication process as it applies to scientific peer-reviewed journals. And then he published the full letter minus any identifiers, which was, a dear doctor, thank you for agreeing to review the enclosed article as mentioned, blah, blah, blah. We'll publish it for you. You just put your name on it. You'll get $1,000 for authoring this article. That's the way it worked. I'm looking forward to talking to you. So, too much of this has gone on. Now, transparency of conflicts of interest has been the preferred method of addressing the prevalence of multi-vested science in the universities. Reporting conflicts of interest is based on the norm of openness in science, including being open about possible biases. It's not the only bias. Some people say, oh, everyone is biased. And it's true, people have their preference for theories, their preference for explanations. But those preferences are in print. They're open to everybody. But when somebody is taking money from a drug company and doing a drug, people don't know about it unless it's listed on their published article. So it's the secret biases that people are concerned about. Okay, so that's the second point. The second point was transparency. The second, and I do think transparency is a good ethical foundation for looking at conflicts of interest. The third is consequentialism. Does financial conflict of interest bias science? Is there evidence that privately funded studies tend to draw pro-industry conclusions? Well, since the mid-1980s, we began to see research in this area. As I said, before that, there were literally no transparency, so you didn't know. You couldn't divide up the studies into those that were funded and those that weren't funded because you didn't know what was funded or who was on which board of which company. And beginning in the mid-'80s, and I think the New England Journal was the first journal that actually required contributors to list their financial conflicts of interest. And then the next year, the Journal of the American Medical Association followed suit. And then finally, the medical journals started doing it more quickly than the science journals. Nature was the last major science journal to adopt conflict of interest policies of the big six. New England Journal, JAMA, British Medical Journal, Lancet, Nature, Science, etc. Nature was the last of the ones to adopt it. And we do have some evidence from tobacco company research and drug research. Tobacco science, probably familiar to more people than some of the others. The tobacco science, they manufactured science. It was that crass. They placed articles in medical literature without revealing the support for the research. They financed a large number of studies, literature reviews, scientific conferences, conducted by front organizations. They had their own so-called nonprofit organizations without revealing their support for the research. They sought to create an ostensibly independent coalition of scientists to critique studies that link tobacco to disease. And I have to say, some of the people who were on the tobacco company dole were at major universities, elite universities. So I think one of the reasons that Harvard School of Public Health has banned any money from tobacco companies is because their institution was implicated in the past in some of this research. They even supported epidemiologists to come up with standards that would raise the bar for trying to establish that secondhand smoke was implicated with cancer. The reason we know all this about the tobacco industry is because the attorney generals of the United States sued them. And they produced voluminous amounts of discovery documents. And from the discovery documents, we knew what was going on in the tobacco industry with trying to create tobacco science, we call it. Here is a statement from the World Health Organization. The tobacco companies planned an ambitious series of studies, literature reviews, and scientific conferences to be conducted by largely front organizations to demonstrate the weaknesses of the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, study of epidemiology to challenge environmental tobacco smoke. And this was published in 2000. And one of the lead authors was a former head of the Food and Drug Administration. So my study of how corporations look at science has gotten me to reach the conclusion that they view science not as a generator of truth, but as one of the many inputs into production. So, you know, the corporations, they see their work, they have a production function, and all these things go into it, and science is one of the inputs, and if the science helps their bottom line, then the science is going to contribute to their production function. Cigarette companies, we've spoken about, but there are other industries, including drugs, agriculture, and the chemical sector, have used their funding of science to discredit criticisms of those who have uncovered risks associated with their products. They've suppressed data of studies they funded when the conclusions were not consistent with their financial interests. And I can't even begin to list all the cases we have that show this. Now, when we think of big pharma, and it's a fairly profitable industry, they fund most of the U.S. drug efficacy and safety studies. They market directly to consumers. They pay for most journals that publish drug studies through advertising. Fund most of the continued education of physicians. They lobby state and federal agencies that adopt drug formularies. They pay for special supplements of journals, and they control what's in the supplements. They fund many symposia and speakers in the grand rounds. They provide gifts, small and large, grants and vacations to doctors. They fund an extensive system of speakers bureaus. They pay speakers, and they go around the country and talk about drugs. They pay the salaries of some members of the FDA. That's hard to believe, but we have a law in the books that has basically the drug companies pay for FDA members, because at one point FDA said, we can't control all the applications for drugs, we need more support. Instead of Congress supporting it, they said, we'll get it from the drug companies. they donate money to medical societies, and they support nonprofit health advocacy organizations. That's a pretty vertically integrated industry in my mind. Now, one of the studies that we did early on was to study the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illness. It's published every few years by the American Psychiatric Association, and it's considered to be the definitive text for categorizing mental disease. And when we studied it, there was no transparency, no disclosure. So there are panels. And at that time, a few years back, when we published this, 2006, there were 170 panel members that determine what the diseases are and classify the diseases. 56% had undisclosed financial interest with the pharmaceutical industry. We had to get this by all sorts of ways, but we couldn't get it by just reading the document because it didn't exist in the document itself. And there were particularly certain panels, like the panel on mood disorders, schizophrenia, and other psychotic disorders, where 100% of the expert panels were financially connected to the companies that manufacture drugs for those disorders. There are some disorders where there weren't drugs, and the number of people financially connected to companies was very small. But wherever there was drugs, then the panel members were had strong financial ties. This gives you an example of, of some of the percentages of the panels and what kinds of financial ties they had with the drug companies. The highest is 100%. There were a bunch at the 80% level, and then a few small ones at 16% or 25%. And that was a time when the New York Times was really reporting on conflicts of interest, and that paper was the first study of its type, so it kind of went viral in its own way. Study medical manuals authors often tied to drug makers. So the question again was, okay, so we found the conflicts of interest, but we didn't do the other tough studies to show what the implications of that was. But some people did. This was an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they asked the question, does the source of funding affect the outcome of research? And they did a meta-study. And this was their conclusion. Evidence suggests that financial ties that intertwine industry investigators and academic institutions can influence the research process. Strong and consistent evidence shows that industry-sponsored research tends to draw pro-industry conclusions. Now, this is a tough journal to get into. It's very tough. The peer reviewers are really tough. I'm sure, I've been a peer reviewer for them. I've had stuff published in JAMA. I know how scrupulous they are. Many journals, they'll have it reviewed by 3 people. JAMA will have it reviewed by 5 people. And they'll have somebody special review the statistics, some statistician review so there's a lot of trust that goes into that. That was the JAMA piece. This was in the New England Journal of Medicine. Authors who supported the use of calcium channel antagonists were significantly more likely than neutral or critical authors to have financial relationships with manufacturers of calcium channel antagonists. So there's a great number of these, a couple of dozen here. There's British Medical Journal, Association Between Competing Interests and Authors' Conclusions, the Journal of Addiction, More Family Practice. Our findings show an association between financial support of published RCTs by commercial interests and outcomes favoring the use of the products being tested. And increasingly, we began to see these articles. So that's when I realized, yes, there really is a funding effect in science, in medicine, And this was one study that was done on the toxicology of bisphenol A, you know, that substance that's sometimes put in plastic bottles, which I hope is not in this one. But the government studies, 94 found positive effects and 10 found negative effects. Chemical corporations, 0 found positive effects and 11 found negative effects. So you're never going to get a positive effect from one of the chemical corporations on bisphenol A. And there have been hundreds of studies indicating, in animal studies mostly, that they're not doing human studies on bisphenol A. It's mostly not ethical, but so if the funding effect is a manifestation of bias, and I'm saying if, there's certainly an effect, then scientists must be aware of financial conflicts of interest as a potential source of the bias. And this requires universal transparency. The biasing effects of financial conflicts of interest may not even reach the consciousness of the researchers with the conflicts. And, you know, people can fool themselves. They say, well, I serve on the advisory committee of this corporation, but I'm not biased. You know, there's lots of ways of being biased, even if it's not fabricating the data. It's the way you write the conclusion of a study. You can write it in many different ways. And some of these studies indicate that the conclusions of corporate-supported studies almost always are in favor of the corporation. Okay, so the third ethical foundation we just talked about, which is consequentialism. Does it affect the outcome of research? And I hope I've given you some evidence that it certainly does and can. The fourth is the integrity of science. That's the fourth and last ethical condition. Protecting the integrity of science is embedded in the scientific ethos. All the accepted norms of science, such as correcting mistakes, punishing scientific misconduct, the peer review process, openness in the way we publish, are part of the ethics of science designed to protect its integrity. A scientific discipline replete with conflicts of interest is likely to lose its integrity in the eyes of the general public. John Zeman, a scientist and sociologist of science who wrote in his book Real Science, expressed it beautifully. In the eyes of the public, the major virtue of academic scientists and their institutions is that even when they do disagree, excuse me, they can be trusted to present what they know without fear or favor. Whether or not this high level of credibility is really justified, it is what gives science its authority in society at large. Without it, not only would the scientific enterprise lose much of its public support, many of the established conventions of a pluralistic democratic society would be seriously threatened. Well, I thought that was so eloquent. And yet, the late John Zeman and I got into a little disagreement in The New Scientist because he believed that even with the loss of disinterestedness in science, science would prevail, and that it would correct itself. And my argument was, yes, maybe it'll correct itself, but in the years it takes to correct itself, a lot of damage can be done. So eliminating disinterestedness from science can, in fact, be pernicious in some ways. So if the protection of scientific integrity is a societal goal and conflict of interest is an obstacle toward that goal, then financial conflict of interest should be viewed as an ethical issue. Moreover, preventing or minimizing conflict of interest becomes an ethical imperative. So those are the 4 ethical foundations. Only 3 of them, I think, really stand up. Is disclosure the antidote to conflict of interest? Well, let's see how it works in the judicial system. A judge about to sentence a convicted felon makes the following disclosure. I will be sentencing the defendant, who has now been tried by his peers, to be incarcerated in a for-profit prison in which I have an equity interest. The extra money I earn from this partnership between my court and a reputable penal institution helps to compensate my low salary, allows me to serve the public interest, and render more thoughtful and objective decisions. Judge, I declare. Well, thankfully, the judicial system would not accept this at this time in our history. But yet, in our scientific and medical institutions, we do accept it. Unfortunately, we have not figured out a way to prevent some of the more egregious conflicts of interest. Survey of scientists' misbehavior some time ago, 2005. Nature magazine did a survey. No, it was funded by the National Institutes of Health, actually. Scientists were asked to report on their own behaviors. You know, when people are asked to report on their own behaviors, they tend to, you know, the effects are usually reduced. You know, they're not going to. But in this case, when asked whether they ever changed the design methodology or results of a study in response to pressure from a funding source, 20.5% of the mid-career scientists and 9.5% of the early career scientists answered affirmatively. So the funding source can have a strong influence on the outcome of science. This was published in Nature in 2005. Okay, in my final few minutes, I'm going to say a word about what NIH has done recently in revising its conflict of interest guidelines, which it first issued in 1995. Scientists who get money from the public health from the Public Health Service, or including NIH, they have to report to the university the financial conflicts of interest they have with companies and other sources. And the university holds this information, and the university is responsible for managing the conflicts of interest. Up until recently, these conflicts of interest were held in under proprietary conditions. In other words, I couldn't get any, as a researcher, I couldn't get any of this information. And the NIH in 95 and 2010 said a financial conflict of interest is a relationship whereby unmanaged, there is a reasonable expectation that the design, conduct, and reporting of the research will not be free from bias. So it's a probability or somebody's expectation that the conflict could induce bias in the result. The way the new guidelines work, first thing that has to happen is the question, the scientist reports his or her income. Is income X a financial conflict of interest? And that question has to be asked and answered. Then the university's responsibility goes to the second question. If income X is a financial conflict of interest, is it a significant financial conflict of interest? That is, significant interest, could it directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of the Public Health Service funded research? So just having a conflict of interest doesn't reach quite the bar yet. The university has to decide if it's a significant financial interest. There's no criteria for doing that except the one they give. Could it directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of the PHS-funded research? So somebody has to take that sentence and figure out whether the money value or where it comes from would do this. Now, if income X is a significant financial conflict of interest, then the financial conflict of interest must be managed. And this requires initial and ongoing reports to PHS, sanctions in cases of non-compliance, etc. So that's the way it operates. And of course, this means that some representative of the university will, usually it's not a faculty member, will have to look at the financial interest, determine from federal guidelines whether it is a substantial financial interest, examine the grant and determine under university guidelines whether it, quote, could directly and significantly affect the design, conduct, or reporting of the project. That places a very high burden on any individual. That he or she might have to do this face-to-face with high-profile scientists, standing face-to-face with them and saying, well, you not only have a financial conflict of interest, you have a significant financial conflict of interest, and it has to be managed, and you have to distance yourself from something or other, or you have to stop doing this research, etc. That's a pretty hard thing for a university to be able to pull off. And it doesn't prevent financial conflicts of interest and may not have any effect on their impact on science. At the times when universities have taken a much harder stand on financial conflicts of interest is when they have been sued, as in the famous case at the University of Pennsylvania, the Jesse Gelsinger case, which was one of the first human gene therapy trials, and a young man died. And the clinical investigator had a company on the side, and the university had equity in the company, and it was all a mess. And the University of Pennsylvania had to pay handily to the family of Jesse Gelsinger. And they increased their conflicts of interest rules and actually prevent now certain financial conflicts of interest from happening. So that puts an end to my talk, and I look forward to your comments, criticisms, and any other questions you might have. Thank you.
So when you were describing the requirements of a productive policy on financial conflicts of interest, one of the words that you used was prevent. But this was also the term that was sort of the basis of the first of the four frameworks you described, the stewardship framework. My question is, even if it's clear that the government and institutions certainly don't do that right now, if there isn't a sort of prophylactic approach to these things, is that a reason why there shouldn't be that sort of approach?
You remember the famous case of Vice President Cheney when he had lots of equity interests in various companies, and he had to put them in a blind trust when he became vice president. And that's a standard that high-level government officials have to meet when they are in an important policy position. Government really does have strict provisions about preventing even the appearance of a conflict of interest. The blind trust means that he cannot make a decision that would affect any financial decision he has in his equity. So the question is, can that model be applied to the scientist? And in some areas that are very, very sensitive, such as clinical trials, or a scientist who has an equity company, has a company, and that company is funding his research, I think universities should absolutely prevent those two kinds of conflicts of interest. That is, somebody who has equity in a company and is doing research related to the products of that company should not be allowed to be getting money at the university from that company to support his or her research. It's too great a conflict. Someone who is in a very sensitive clinical trial, human clinical trial, should have no conflicts of interest with any of the products or procedures or techniques that they are using. The other areas, I think, have to be managed more appropriately, because then you get into the question of is the research going to affect the outcome of the studies? In those cases, I think what you have to do is you have to have preventative measures in the contracts. Under no circumstances should the university accept a contract of an outside sponsor that limits the autonomy of the investigator, that either says they have to show the sponsor the research before they get published, or they have to let the sponsor know where they're going to publish it in any way. So I think the main thing is to protect the autonomy of the independent researcher at the university. And as far as preventing all external funding, I don't think that's a sensible way to do it. I think you can get honest researchers who, with the right contracts and the right protections of the university, who will do the work honestly and not and disclose their interests and do good science. I don't think you have to go the route of government and try to stop every potential conflict of interest, every potential financial conflict of interest.
I have a question about what you were presenting about your third principle, which
Consequentialism?
yes, and that there was a distortion of the science, if I follow you.
Well, clearly in tobacco there was. In the drug areas, what they found was that there were differences in the outcome of studies. Right. Bias is a more complex thing to reach that conclusion. It's a reasonable hypothesis when you see enough data that all the studies funded by the drug companies are favorable to their outcome, and all the ones that are not are at least emphasizing more the risks. The simplest hypothesis, using Occam's razor, is to say that the scientists have internalized the values of their sponsor. But it's conceivable that there are other hypotheses.
Right, and my question really was following up on what you just said. In the paper that was in Science, Technology, and Human Values, you were very guarded about the causative nature of this funding effect, and were, I think, appropriately careful about concluding what you could about why the funding effect was there.
Yeah, the funding effect is one effect, but bias is something at another level. And I think that there are conditions where you can demonstrate bias, but you have to be much more careful, and you have to go into the research methods, and you have to really probe much more deeply to demonstrate bias. But the funding effect is the first indicator that there might be bias. And it's certainly an indicator that the government has adopted because they have imposed these transparency guidelines. But no, there's different ways that bias can evolve, and there's different ways that you can get different outcomes. And you have to define bias. I try to define it in the paper. It's an intentional thing, or it's a methodological thing. You look and say, well, this person's methodology is very likely to give them this effect. Let me give you one good example of bias, and it's in the field of chemical testing. So let's suppose you want to test a chemical to see if it's an endocrine disruptor. It has a hormonal effects on animals. There are certain chemicals that, when they're ingested, will attach to receptors in our cells, and they'll activate those cells, and they'll produce hormones that we are not supposed to, like plastics or pesticides, that will produce hormones in our bodies that we don't want. These are exogenous chemicals that are producing estrogen that we don't want in our bodies, et cetera. So let's suppose you have the chemical companies doing it. Well, they choose adult mice, rats, that are very robust, and they don't respond well to these chemicals. And versus other people who choose pregnant mice, and they see the effects on the progeny of pregnant mice, which are the most sensitive of the species. That is, the young mice that are growing are going to be the most sensitive. So here you have two different methods. One method shows you no outcome. The other method shows you a big outcome. And you say, well, you could say that there's methodological bias because one is using very insensitive instruments to show the results. And the other, I mean, if you want to show an effect, you know, then you try to use the most sensitive instrument. Or let's suppose you have, I'll use the old philosopher of science thing. Let's suppose you wanted to prove that all crows are black. So you obviously don't want to go to just one location, you see all the black crows, and say, okay, everyone I've counted here is black. You want to say to yourself, well, wait a minute now. Where in the world would, if there were a white crow, where would it be? You know, where's the land where you see a lot of white species? Let's go out and try to disprove the all crows are black. You use a much more sensitive test. So that's a kind of bias that you'll see creeping up in some of these tests. But hey, the scientists can say, we used an animal, we did the test correctly, we got no effect. But built into their methodology is a certain assumption of insensitive instruments.
I was thinking about work in like the epistemologies of ignorance and agnotology, the study of ignorance, some of which has been done here at Penn State. And we're just thinking about, okay, so how ignorance functions. And the question of not only do we not know that, but why do we not know that? Especially in regard to something that's so problematic in terms of potentially biasing research outcomes. And so I was wondering, I find this actually even more interesting given that, especially as the quote that you put up on the screen during your presentation about kind of the integrity of science and the nobility of science, and kind of the scientific paradigm as being like the paradigm of truth, of objectivity, of not being biased, right? So the opposition is even that much more interesting or even ironic. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about how this ignorance is produced. And that's a massive question, but I'm wondering if you could say more about kind of the mechanisms by which this conflict of interest is cloaked, and why even in the scientific community where there is ostensibly such a community to truth, to objectivity, that there could be so little awareness actually of kind of the extent of the problem that you're talking about.
By and large, the scientific community wants to regulate itself and has tried to regulate itself over many years. And they were not happy overall with any additional restrictions on science. We start to see restrictions on science post-World War II. Radioactive materials regulated. Then we saw the regulation of chemicals in labs. The regulation of recombinant DNA technology regulated. Clinical trials regulated in the 1970s. Before the 1970s, if you were doing clinical trials, you just pick somebody up from the street, or you go to Tuskegee, or you go to the prisons, or you go to mental institutions, and you just grab people and you put them in a clinical trial. So all of this is kind of, you know, increasing the regulatory oversight of science. And typically, scientists like to do things on their own, the self-regulation, and then came conflict of interest. And they certainly didn't want any more regulations on conflict of interest. It's just another burden. We want to do our research. So I think the scientific community is not eager to publicize, number one, the kinds of conflicts that exist. Certainly the American Psychiatric Association, they didn't decide to put all the conflicts of interest. And boy, when they finally published them in the DSM-5, the latest one, we did a study comparing the conflicts of interest in DSM-4 and DSM-5, and we found the amazing thing that even though the people involved now have to report their open conflicts of interest openly, there were more conflicts in DSM-5 than there were in DSM-4. It didn't stop the amount of conflicting issues. I don't think that the scientific community is eager to publicize this to the public. I don't think they want to dissuade the public that science, and largely still is, the most, of all the ways we fix belief, it's probably, as Charles Peirce once said, it's probably the most effective one we have for fixing our beliefs. And I don't think they want to disabuse the public that there's something preventing science from people from believing in science. And in certain cases, like in the vaccine case, the public health scientists were really disturbed that people didn't believe in vaccines, or they believed that vaccines were going to cause autism. And all of a sudden, people were not vaccinating their children. And I think the scientific community is very well aware that if the public doesn't believe in the enterprise of science, then they will start to act maybe irrationally. If you don't vaccinate your kids, all of a sudden, whooping cough is going to be on the rise, which it is. You know, so I think there's definitely a concern that emphasizing this issue in the public might actually create a kind of distancing away from science to other sources of belief other than the scientific research. That's my best guess.
So there was a recent expose, I guess, that was just published in Science magazine about the peer review process. And publication is really the medium for disseminating scientific results. And basically what was done was they had the person in charge generated these fake papers under the same kind of thing. I think it was a cancer drug, and they purposely designed a bad experiment that was flawed. Totally. And they basically disseminated these to open access journals. And the implication is open access may have a conflict of interest with respect to publication because they're getting the money just to publish and maybe trying to get flashy results published through that. And so it's almost like layered on top of what you're talking about with these particular conflicts of interest. The medium is corrupt, maybe, in the peer review process.
I remember the editor of JAMA told me one time, he said, the editor-in-chief of JAMA told me that we have an absolute firewall between our marketing department, the department that takes the advertisements from the drug companies, et cetera, and our editorial department. You know, she said it quite faithfully to me, and she, when she got threats of lawsuits, Dr. DeAngelis just would put on her deep Italian accent and say, you can do what you want. You can sue me if you want. You know, she was extremely, Catherine DeAngelis was a great supporter of the integrity of the journal. And this story, of course, shook a lot of people. And it reminded me of that story that some years ago, when that article was published in a social science journal. And it was just a bizarre article about, I don't know, you know, it was in a journal that dealt with text. And it had all kinds of sort of the language of somebody who studies text. And then it got accepted and it got published. And then the author said, this article was all made up. You know, I just put together these fancy words and phrases. And it also got a lot of attention. It was a test of the peer review process or whatever. The peer review process has to be studied and has to be looked at because it is a very important process, and we get a lot of stuff that comes through, unfortunately. And I think this effort was to showcase the open access journals and whether or not they really do have a fundamental conflict, because for those of you who don't understand this, these journals are open to everybody, right? Any citizen can go on. You don't have to have a special key to get in or a special, but if you want to publish in it, what do you think the costs of publication of a paper are? Do you know what the costs are? How much?
$1,000, $10,000.
$1,000, $2,000. So it would cost. Now, if you have a grant that will pay for that, that's fine. But if you don't have a grant, you can't publish in there. And there, you know, the question is, and I think this study does raise the issue of what kind of peer review process do they have. Now, they did send that article to a couple of non-open access journals, or was it one of the open access journals did not accept it? Is that correct? Which one? PLOS One. Yes. PLOS One. I've both been accepted and rejected in PLOS One, so I know their review process. But it opens up a whole new kind of investigation. I think science has to figure out what these journals are and what kind of peer review they have. I don't know there's a simple answer to it. Do you have any thoughts?
I think it just shook us up
Yeah.
in terms of, but I think it revealed the conflict of the publisher, and I think part of it is because of the publication model changing over time that has created this conflict of interest, that you make money based on these people giving you a paper, and NIH is actually creating this, because if you have NIH funds, you have to have open access articles.
Yes, and therefore you have to use your NIH budget to pay for the open access journals. So they want people to have access to the information, but they might have gotten something they didn't expect. Has anybody published in open access journals here? Yeah. What was been your experience? You have too. Do you have any experience with it in terms of PLOS One? Oh, so you published at the peak of it. Yeah. It's always my sense that, you know, I once did a study and found out there were 20,000 journals in the world, science and medical journals, not all of English language, 20,000 journals. And it always occurred to me that if somebody has a paper, they're likely, if they keep going down the list, they're likely to find some journal that is in dire need to fill its volume up. There's a great difference between law and science in many ways. But in law, I'm told by people who write law review articles, they send the law review article to like 30 journals at once, which we in science are not permitted to do. You know, you have to send it to one at a time. They'll even ask you, have you sent this to anyone else? But in law, they can send it to 30 journals. And the first one they get a positive review, they'll take, and they'll get it published. Of course, the law review articles are not peer-reviewed. They're reviewed by law students. So they don't have a peer review process. But the one thing that the law students do is make sure that the notes are correct. That's all they do, is check the notes, that you have a note for every sentence that you write. But no, I think peer review is a very serious problem, and it needs to be studied more.
I think, you know, the paper that I published in, it was in another peer-reviewed journal. It was Genes, Genetics, and Genomes, which is under the Genetic Society of America publication. So it's, from my standpoint, it was a trust I already had trust in genetics,
Yeah.
and that it was an umbrella organization that I already had good faith
Do they have open access?
Yeah,
Oh, they do.
yes.
Was that one of the journals that was implicated?
No, I don't know that they were tested.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Yeah. I hope it puts everybody on call. But in general, the peer review process, and I was talking to some people about it today, I don't think enough people in the scientific community, social and physical sciences, pay as much attention to their peer review responsibility that they do. Some people just do it fast and they don't do it very carefully. And, you know, if they're busy, you don't get a lot of credits for doing peer review. The only field I know that gives out credits for peer review is the medical field, where they will give you continuing medical education points for doing a peer review. So I've accumulated a lot of points that I can't use because I don't need continuing medical education, and I can't trade them or anything like that. But the other journals, really, you do it as a responsibility to your field, nothing else. And some people just don't take that responsibility as seriously as others, and it demeans the entire field. I think that's probably what that whole situation means.
But I was instructed by my mentors that it's that responsibility for all the papers that you've gotten published, but I also look at it as I benefit from it because I keep on top of what's going on.
Yes, yes. And your job as a peer reviewer is to do what the famous sociologist of science, Robert Merton, said: one of the core values of science is organized skepticism. You have to look at the paper and say, okay, I'm going to start out being skeptical. And if the paper changes my skepticism and reaches my approval, or if I can improve it in some way, then I've done my job. But if we're not skeptical in science, then we would just allow anything to come through. So even when we get rejected, it's an honor. Somebody has taken us seriously. But you know, it may be that they didn't feel that the result was important enough for this journal. You know, like Nature and Science, you know, they'll say, well, this is perfectly a good article, but it's not important enough for us. It needs to go in the sort of the more specialized journals. And then we start to go down the list and see what happens, you know.
You concluded your discussion of the fourth principle, the one on integrity of science, pretty strongly, saying that preventing or minimizing COI was an ethical imperative. And then when you went on further and talked about the NIH policies, you made a point of how difficult it is to decide what's important, what's significant. And so I wondered if you might be willing to take another step along the line of what you would recommend. Because it seems like we're kind of stuck on it.
Well, in science and the private interest, I tried. I looked at the drug industry. I investigated a lot of the literature on how drugs are reviewed, and a lot of the literature on the funding effect of drugs. And I came to the conclusion that there's no way to fix it by tweaking it. There's just no way. So I said the best, I mean, if you build an airplane or an engine like Boeing, I don't want Boeing doing the safety testing of the plane. I mean, they could do the safety, but I want an independent entity to evaluate the safety of the airplane. Or a nuclear power plant. I don't want General Electric to be the only entity that evaluates the safety of the nuclear power plant. I want an independent group, and I don't want the company that makes it to have that independent group in their arm's length and funded by them. I think it has to be a firewall. So what I suggested in the drug industry is you got a great drug, your company, okay. You give it to the National Institute of Drug Testing. That's an entity that takes your drug and finds and vets the right person to assess its efficacy and its safety, and contracts out with that party to test the drug. So therefore, the relationship is between the National Institute of Drug Testing and the investigator, and then they report back the results, and it's owned by the National Institute of Drug Testing. They take the results and they give it back to the drug company. If those results are good, great. The drug company gives it to the Food and Drug Administration, and they get a license for the drug. Terrific. Now we have clear boundaries. That's not the way it exists today. The way it exists today is that the drug company hires a company, private company. They don't even use academic research as much as they used to. They use private companies to test the drug, and then they get the data back and they give the data to the FDA. So the drug companies have a relationship with a private company or with an academic scientist who's been on their financial dole for a number of years. That's just not going to work in the long term. You're going to keep getting those financial interests turned into bias. So that's why every once in a while we're going to see drug companies get found out. They either didn't report one of the studies because it was negative, or they changed the protocols during the clinical trials so that they can tweak out some positive outcome. There's all kinds of ways that this is done. It would be cleaner if there was the firewall between the drug companies and the people doing the testing, and they wouldn't be developing this cozy relationship with them. But in this climate, at least somebody has a different model. In this climate, though, we're likely to continue the way we have been. So my advice to most people is, as much as you can, stay away from drugs.
So just before I ask you to join me in thanking Dr. Grimsky, I should say that idea is definitely not dead, because Harvard is having a symposium on money blinds, inspired by, organized by Chris Robertson, whose work is inspired by Dr. Grimsky's. Oh. So your idea is still alive and well. I just want to thank also, one of our speakers was Michael Burrows, who's the new assistant director of the Rock Ethics Institute and who makes everything run smoothly on a day-to-day basis. So thank you too, and please now join me in thanking Dr. Grimsky for a superb talk.
Thank you.